Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Deep Dive into Appium for Flutter app. My name is Sharon here at HeadSpin, and I just want to thank you all for joining us here today. Our presenter today is Kazuaki Matsuo, Senior Software Engineer of Device Automation at HeadSpin. Before handing this off to Kazuaki, I want to provide a quick intro on who we are and what we do for those who are new to HeadSpin. The HeadSpin platform is a powerful, easy-to-use solution that enables development, QA, product, and operations teams to accelerate release cycles, build for complex real-world user environments, and know whenever any component of the system degrades or breaks, whether at the code, device, or network layer, and anywhere in the world. Our platform offers an extensive on-prem and cloud-hosted global device infrastructure, as well as machine learning-driven performance and quality of experience analytics for testing and monitoring mobile, web, audio, and video applications in real time. Now, before we start, please drop any questions in the Q&A box below. And just a reminder that the session is also being recorded and will be provided to you all afterwards. Now to hand it over to Kazu. Welcome, Kazu.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for your introduction. And let me start my talk. Hi, my name is Kazuaki Matsuo. My talk is about deep dive into Appium for Flutter app. I will explain appium-flutter-driver stuff, focusing on how it works in technical perspective. Let's start this talk. First, let me share about me. My name is Kazuaki Matsuo. My current role at HeadSpin is Senior Software Engineer, Device Automation. I'm working on integrating automation tools into our platform and extending device automation support in our platform. I also work on Appium project. I've been working on the project for probably around 5 years. My GitHub account is Kazukokor. Maybe someone may know this account when you find some Appium stuff. Today's topic is, I have mainly 4. It starts to explain about Flutter and the important thing for appium-flutter-driver. After that, my talk will go about Appium stuff. I will explain when appium-flutter-driver can work and when cannot work. So after my talk today, you will learn how Flutter Appium driver communicate with Flutter components. And then you also can learn when the appium-flutter driver is not available technically. It will help you to choose proper tool chain for your testing purpose in Flutter world. Let's go ahead. The first topic is overview of the Flutter in your test perspective. I won't explain Flutter app itself. Instead, I will explain some basic something about the Flutter, which will be related to appium-flutter-driver. Flutter components is built on .vm. So basically, each Appium-Flutter app generates its UI component on .runtime. This .vm is a very important thing today. Flutter team explained its testing basis. Flutter already has 3 types of testing tools, named unit and widget test are out of today's topic. They are mainly for non-UI or basic logic something, so they are not related to UI component. So today's topic is related to integration test. Flutter already has packages named Flutter Driver. The concept is similar to Selenium on Flutter. They also released the integration test package name. It is available since Flutter 2. But the integration test package is a bit more gray box style. So Flutter driver provided by Flutter team is like a more black box testing, and integration test is like a for gray box testing, like Espresso in Android. As appium-flutter-driver, this Flutter Driver package is important. This package has APIs that allow us to interact with elements on the .vm for Appium components. If we can call these APIs in some ways, we're able to interact with Flutter components with these Flutter Driver API commands. Let me explain one important thing in Flutter about the .vm stuff. This will be a very important part in the next Appium Flutter stuff. This blue square in the means the Flutter application on the device. The application built Flutter UI components on the .vm. So basically, Flutter has its own layer to build its UI component. It is .vm. One interesting in the .vm is it can export WebSocket connection. It means if we can access to the WebSocket connection, we'll be able to communicate with a .vm from outside the application directory. This is a very good news for development tools, since we can potentially interact with components directory, Flutter components directory. This URL style is like this. So the .vm exports HTTP localhost and an arbitrary port number and some random root. Once we connect to the WebSocket URL using some WebSocket client, and then the URL will upgrade to WebSocket connection, and we can proceed some sending and getting some command over the WebSocket. It is a very general WebSocket thing. And then the client can communicate with a .vm over the WebSocket. This fact is important because it means we can access to the .vm from outside the device. And it means we can send .vm commands like Flutter Driver. I introduced a few previous slides over the WebSocket. So this technical thing is a very basic thing in Appium Flutter Driver. I will explain later. Okay, go ahead. I explained mainly two things in the Flutter. One is .vm and the WebSocket connection. The other is Appium Flutter Driver component, which is provided by Flutter team. The next step is start talking about the Flutter Appium stuff. Before starting talking about Flutter stuff, Appium Flutter stuff, let me explain Flutter basis before. Appium basis before. Appium is client server-side architecture. So there is a client we call Appium client, which is test code. For example, Ruby or Python, Java or some languages, like a JavaScript as well. The Appium client communicated with Appium server. This Appium server is this central Appium logmark. The communication is HTTP following the web driver W3C spec. And the Appium server communicates with each device in several ways. For example, it depends on OS and devices. For example, in Android case, the communication path is basically ADV, and some command send ADV command directly to the device, and some command is over HTTP port forwarding the ADB. So if this Appium server can communicate with .vm and the Flutter component over some ways, then it means we can interact with Flutter application using Appium client, same as other devices. Let me show two main ways to treat the Flutter app. One way is calling Flutter Driver APIs via an app running on the same .vm. The second one is sending Flutter Driver APIs over the WebSocket. It means there are two ways. The first thing is Appium can launch a server on the .vm. The server can call Appium driver the server can call Flutter Driver APIs directly. So the server calls proper APIs against Appium's API call. So the first thing is like the app and the test have a thing that server on the app for testing. The second one is over the WebSocket connection. Then Appium does not need to install additional component like the first one. It can call Flutter Driver APIs and with low layer commands directly to the .vm layer. The benefit of the first server style is Appium do not need to consider behind Appium driver APIs because Flutter team will maintain the Appium Flutter driver packages. The second one can communicate with .vm directly. It is a very good benefit, but it means potentially the drivers should maintain low layer APIs, which is behind some APIs could be behind the Flutter Driver APIs, but yeah, calling APIs directly means that we potentially need we need to maintain some internal stuff. Each of them have prototype and implemented by, I implemented the first one as a prototype and the second one is other guy. Today's Appium Flutter driver is the second one way. It will communicate with the application running on the .vm directory. Okay, I explained .vm and the Flutter driver by Flutter team at the first section, and then I explained about Flutter. I explained about Appium and how Appium Flutter driver send Flutter driver commands over WebSocket to the .vm. The next topic is focusing on Appium Flutter driver. Before starting some explanation, let me focus on Android to simplify my explanation. I explained Appium communicated with the .vm over the WebSocket in Appium Flutter driver, but I haven't explained how to know the URL. It's very easy on Android. On Android case, once the app can expose the URL, you can observe the output in the logcat. Logcat is a logs on the device. So Appium can get the exposed WebSocket URL in the logcat. The format is like this. Hopefully you can see these blue lines in around the bottom place. So the word has the observed battery listing on blah, 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 blah. The blue layer, blah, 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 is the URL, which is can attach to the URL over WebSocket. So Appium can observe the URL watching the lookout via ADV. And once Appium can observe the URL, Appium can proceed connecting to the .vm and establish the WebSocket connection. But wait, is the URL always available in the lookout? If the .vm is always available over the WebSocket, we can get data or some interact with .vm whenever very easy. This fact could be a security hole on the device. So the answer for is the URL always available in the lookout is no. By default, the WebSocket URL is not available. Lookout doesn't print the URL. To enable it, the app must have enable Flutter Driver extension method call and debug build. So if your app does not have this method call, Flutter app and the Flutter Driver, especially Flutter Driver, won't work. It is because Flutter Driver cannot observe, appium-flutter-driver cannot observe the WebSocket URL to establish the connection. Okay, let me show 2 demos from now on. Before showing demos, let me explain about demo target. Today's demo app is very easy and simple thing. I created this demo app with Flutter create command. The demo app is just a initial template thing. The app have the plus icon in the bottom right place, and once you click the plus button, then the number in the center of this view will increase. Today's Appium client is .driver. I built this Appium client for language because in many cases we want to write test code the same languages with applications. So I created this .driver Appium client before. I will use this client today. The test code is this. Appium has these capabilities. Once Appium client sends these capabilities to Appium server, then Appium server will establish an Appium session using these capabilities. The important thing to use Flutter Driver, Appium Flutter Driver, is you should express automation name as Flutter. The scenario is like this. So the client tries to find an element named increment, and if the element exists, then the client click the button 10 times, and after that, the client tries to find 10 word, the word of 10 in the view. If the element exists on the view, then the test will pass, but the number 10 doesn't exist, for example, 9 or 0 or something, then no such element exception will raise. Then test fails. Okay, let's go ahead to demos. The first one is without enable Flutter Driver extension case. I explained without enable Flutter Driver extension case, Flutter Driver cannot interact with Flutter UI, Flutter component over the WebSocket because lookout does not exports a lookout does not print the WebSocket URL. So this expected result is fail. Let me share, change my screen mode. This is a video I captured last night. Currently, the test target is probably used by someone. So let me play this video instead. This case is expressed automation name as Flutter, and the app is this one. This REST application has no extension, so it means the app won't export the WebSocket URL, and it has some package name. I will share this repository after this talk. And the scenario has this increment, find the increment, and try to click the button 10 times and try to find it 10 word. Once we start the script, then the test target start running on HeadSpin device. You can see some logs in the Appium server. So just a moment. This is a demo app. The test failed, and the test result was some failed to create a session. It is expected result because I explained the demo one. First thing, does not have enable Flutter Driver extension option. So the test should be failed because it means the app doesn't expose the WebSocket URL. The next one is with enable Flutter Driver extension. So the next step should be passed. Let me change my screen again. Current video stream is with debug build up. Oops. Just a moment. Yeah. The initial demo was the upper thing. So the test target is this raised one. And from this time, I will use this debug build, which has the extension to expose WebSocket URL. And the scenario is the same. Try to find an element which has increment keys and click 10 times and try to find the word 10 in the view. in demo app, I explicitly set full reset capability in Appium to keep cleaning the test target, before starting the session. So it takes a bit more time than usual to prepare the session. Yeah, the test app launches, and yeah, it's cool. Yeah, the click action 10 times worked, and the test result 10 word could find on the view. Okay, perfect. Let's go back to their side. So in second demo, the test passed because the Flutter app exports the WebSocket URL by enable Flutter Driver extension. The next topic is using UI Automata 2 driver in Appium. I've shown two types of demos just before, with and without enable Flutter Driver extension case in the app. In general, with build, it should not have the option, the enable Flutter Driver extension option, because it exposes the .pm connection as you already learned. It could be a security risk. Attackers can access to your applications and get many data, or can interact with some actions with .pm directory. So usually you will disable this enable Flutter driver extension in your RIS app. So do we have to wait no way to interact with the Flutter app without the extension? The answer is no. Even in the case, you can interact with the Flutter app using other drivers in Appium, but the use case is limited than just a Flutter driver. For instance, it is your Automata 2 driver. It gets application data via Android accessibility feature. So if elements on the application, Flutter application, can be detected by the feature, accessibility feature, then UI Automata 2 driver will work and can interact with components with them. So let's try to use UI Automata 2, and then we need to change some code, test code. Let me explain the changes. First, the automation name should be UI Automata 2 instead of Flutter. And test scenario, you need to re-implement some find element or something. The scenario should be not the same, because originally the Flutter driver was built by a person who was new in Appium. So some API interface is not well compatible with existing Appium commands. So you need to convert some command from Flutter driver to general Appium command, like our find element stuff. And let me show a demo again. This demo has the UI Automata 2 automation name. And in this demo, the test target is the release build. This build is my first demo, which failed with Flutter Driver. The second demo used the next line's applications as a test target. And the test scenario also converted from Flutter to UI Automata 2. The Flutter one was commented out. And let's start the test code. Okay, click the plus button and increment the number and test done as a pass. Okay, go back to the slide. Okay, that's all. I explained there are some Flutter and the Flutter driver thing, and using Flutter appium-flutter-driver and without appium-flutter-driver case. Let's take a look at some tips. This is not, I focused on a bit deep fundamental technical thing, which is very important in Flutter appium-flutter-driver today. There are many APIs to interact with elements with Flutter Driver APIs maintained by Flutter team. So I didn't explain much about the APIs, but you can find APIs in this GitHub URL. The repository has some documentations. And like a race build, which does not export WebSocket URL, sometimes the appium-flutter-driver cannot work technically. Then accessibility feature by Android OS or iOS help to interact with them. To learn some accessibility features, you can take a look at the link in Flutter applications. So to make your application accessible by accessibility features, it means the app will be more accessible by UI Automata 2 driver or other drivers without appium-flutter-driver. And tips about iOS stuff a bit. I explained Android mainly, but iOS also has some tips to work with Flutter. But one not good thing is since iOS 14, Flutter itself gets some limitations than before previous OS versions. So if you want to use Flutter driver against over iOS 14, then you need some workaround to work with them, but it can. And the next thing is, even you do not use Flutter appium-flutter-driver, you can interact with many UI component extending OS accessibility service. By default, this accessibility service is disabled, but once you launch settings up and go to their accessibility preference and spoken content and enable speaker selection, speaker screen, then iOS exports UI element for voiceover. So appium-xcuitest-driver also can find them as a UI element, same as accessibility features by OS. Okay, let's go ahead and takeaways again. Today, I explained about Flutter and .vm, and they expose WebSocket URL. So appium-flutter-driver can communicate with the Flutter component over .vm using the WebSocket. You learn this. And the next thing, important thing is the URL, WebSocket URL is not always available because that is could be a security hole in the REST app. In that case, you can interact with the app using your Automata 2 driver, but their usage is very limited than vanilla Flutter driver because in that case, you can interact with elements via accessibility features. So if the app under test does not have much accessibility something, then the interaction will be very limited than vanilla appium-flutter driver. But you can do automate using your Automata 2 driver against rebuild. That's all for today. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kazu. We'll now move on to the Q&A session. So we'll start with the ones that came in during the session, but if you have any other questions in the next couple of minutes, feel free to drop them in the chat box below. All right. So number one, what about iOS support for the Flutter driver?
Yes, for iOS, I explained a bit briefly in this section. Basically, in rebuild, iOS 14 over iOS 14, rebuild probably cannot. No, debug build has some limitations, so you need to build the debug build using some additional flag, which is probably, I forget, but profile flag to expose the WebSocket URL on the device. So the usage of iOS case is very limited than Android, but you can, and you also can do some interactions using xcuitest-driver then, if Flutter appium-flutter-driver is not available on iOS. Also.
All right, and someone asked, what is the difference between the official Flutter driver and appium-flutter-driver?
Yeah. Here, when automating Flutter applications using Appium, there is two types of drivers. First, if you want to interact with some Flutter driver specific thing, you can find some documentations which only for Flutter apps, internal thing. It is necessary on .vm, and it needs communicate with .vm directly. If your application has some such feature and you want to interact with them, then you must use appium-flutter-driver or use official Flutter integration test or Flutter driver by Flutter team, because UI Automata 2 driver cannot interact with them. But if your test target is rebuild, which does not have WebSocket URL to communicate with .vm, you must use your Automata 2 driver, or you can use Espresso driver, which is the alternative thing in Appium to automate Android applications. Both you can choose either way or both ways. So if your test target is in debug build, then you can use Flutter driver and the Flutter packages by Flutter team. But if you want to run some critical path against Greece build, then probably UI Automata 2 driver will be a good selection for you. That's all.
All right, and the third question is, which is more preferred to automate Flutter app? I believe they're referring to the two drivers that you had covered.
Which driver is now? Oh yeah. So it depends on the situation. But if you can, for debug build, and you can use both way via Flutter driver and via your Automata 2 driver, and then easier way is probably using your Automata 2 driver, because it does not interact with the .vm internal thing. So test scenario could be more easier, and the API also same as other drivers. So you can decrease learning cost for the for each appium driver. But when you want to manage some internal state, like a login state or some shopping cart state, for example, and to build such situation on the .vm, probably Flutter driver can preset the such state via .vm directory. In that case, the Flutter driver is preferred than UI Automata 2, because UI Automata 2 cannot do such thing, which means the access to the driver .vm internal thing. So you can, in UI Automata 2, you can only interact with element you can observe using accessibility features by OS. Also,
Great, thank you. And the last question we have for today is, what clients have Finder commands for appium-flutter-driver?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just a moment. Yeah, I explained there are some Flutter driver has a special APIs code. So like this slide and the upper side, the Flutter command has a special finder, appium-flutter-finder dot by key value string. This is a appium-flutter specific thing. You cannot use the API call in vanilla appium client. In vanilla client, appium client, usually you can find some command like this bottom side. So driver find element, blah, blah, blah. So if you want to use Flutter driver and call Flutter driver specific APIs defined by Flutter driver, then you need to use Flutter driver component for appium client, or you need to define some method by yourself. As Flutter driver, I implemented some libraries for some client, Python, Ruby, this dart driver, and JavaScript also, and Java client also available. So totally Java and JavaScript and Ruby, Python, and Dart are available for Flutter appium driver. That's all.
Thank you, Kazu. All right, looks like those are all the questions we have for today. If you come up with any questions later on, please reach out to any of us afterwards on our website on our contact us form. Thank you everyone for joining. Just a reminder, there will be a recording sent to you all afterwards, probably later today or tomorrow. And please be sure to check out any of our other events on our website that are happening next month or so. Thank you. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you very much for listening to my talk.
Thank you all.